Hello, everyone. This is Andrea Ledger, and I will be presenting Chapter 10, Managing Resistance. This chapter talked about when you and your therapist, or us as a therapist or counselor, is of a different ethnicity than our clients and how we handle that resistance. All right, so a chapter summary. What this chapter talked about was unmanaged resistance in a multicultural counseling can lead to unintentional racism on the part of the counselor. Many counselors who are skilled in diagnosis and intervention planning are equally unskilled in handling resistance, especially with minority clients. In this chapter, I will discuss defined resistance, present a typology for classifying clients' behavior as resistance and non-resistance, and describe 6 strategies counselors can use to help manage resistance. So one important thing that I took away from this chapter was counselors need to understand that just because a client is in counseling is not an obvious sign that the person is dedicated to change. Most people in counseling are ambivalent, have ambivalent feelings toward change, and some people have a vested interest in not changing at all, which is weird because you would think that people go to counseling to get help to feel better, but some don't. So that was interesting that I read in this chapter. So I'm going to discuss 6 principles of resistance. So resistance 1, resistance is reflected in the behavior. So that's when the client is outwardly showing you resistance. Despite the fact that resistant attitude and psychological states are strong drivers of client's behavior, resistance is not a client's attitude or state. Even though a counselor might conclude from a client's behavior that the client has a resistant attitude, only the client's behavior actually demonstrate resistance. In order to overcome resistance, methods must focus first on behavior and then the attitude. So basically, they're saying ignore the attitude and focus on the behavior. They came. So we want to focus on the fact that they came and work on the attitude later. Principle number 2, resistance is counter-therapeutic. Counseling sessions may be cut short prematurely due to resistance. The process may be slowed down, the client may become self-defeating, or both. No matter how the client resists, they always lose. Resistance can have many effects depending on its form, intensity, and management by the counselor. I don't know why. Counselor. Principle number 3, resistance is goal directed. The client's attempt to avoid the difficult requirement of change is called resistance. Similar to a major surgery, counseling sessions can be traumatic. The client can believe that staying in an unhealthy state is more painful than changing, meaning that changing costs more money than staying in the same state. The uncertainty that comes with change can be extremely frightening. This one, I thought about this one, and this one is so true because when you first start counseling, it's so painful because you're bringing up all those things that we buried for so long, and some people can't take that pain, and it's just easier to stay where they were, which was dealing with what they already knew how to deal with, the trauma. They already knew how to deal with that, but having to work through it is a different aspect for them, and we may see resistance in counseling because of that. Number 4, resistance typically involves discriminate avoidance of pain. They stay away from any kind of pain, whether it is required pain for therapy or unneeded pain with no therapeutic benefits. They may experience the discomfort of change so strongly that their initial and only response is to avoid it. However, avoiding them has a high cost. It sacrifices opportunity for healing, personal development, and living a more full life. So we want to always focus on the positive side of therapy, because the clients will focus on the process. We got to get them to the other side of the pain. So that's the most important part. Principle number 5, resistance can take a variety of forms. Resistance is any counter-therapeutic conduct, regardless of its form. Different clients may deploy various forms of resistance, and one client may use a variety of forms. According to I'm not sure how to say this, Kanban, 1982. Some examples of resistant behavior include missing sessions, arriving late, avoiding inquiries, and draw attention to the counselor. The dominating the conversation, subject matter, and putting the counselor in an awkward position. So basically the counselor starts to deflect. They start to focus on other things instead of putting it back on them. And when that doesn't work, they start to miss sessions, they don't come on time, so you don't have enough time to help them go through the process. So that is another form of resistance. Resistance may or may not be observed, depending on whether the behavior occurs in public or private. Unless the counselor is skilled enough to recognize its effects, they are unlikely to be aware of private resistance. Even observing clients struggle to identify clients withholding of critical facts that could influence diagnosis and treatment plans, as in the case of a client in question. The counselor must admit that both observable and observable resistance obstruct counseling. This typology box talks about 4 types of resistance and non-resistance and how you can identify each one. So on the next page, on the next slide, we're going to break them down and we're going to talk about each one. Antagonism, change opposing behavior contributing to counter-therapeutic effects. Antagonistic clients directly oppose counselors' effects to promote change. They often arrive at premature conclusions about the benefit of counseling, and many of them pay little attention to the merit of counselors' treatment recommendation. Then there's acquiescence, change promoting behavior contributing to counter-therapeutic effects. Acquiescence is a resistance on the surface. Acquiescent clients may seem to go along with the counseling, accepting counselor's treatment recommendations uncritically. They are uncommitted to change. Protest, change opposing behavior contributing to therapeutic effects. Protests may appear to be similar to antagonism, but there is a major difference between these clients' behavior. Unlike antagonism, protests involve the client's critical evaluation of the counselor's treatment recommendation. A protesting client is a client who has made a basic commitment to therapeutic change. Compliance, change promoting behavior contributing to therapeutic effects. Compliant clients participate actively in counseling. They're dedicated to personal change and growth. Although change may be painful, they do not allow the pain to prevent them from complying with the counselor's recommendation. So of the two, antagonism and acquiescence are the resistant clients, and protest and compliance are the 2 clients that are non-resistant to the counseling session. How do you manage this? What do we do when we get a client that is resistant? Right here, I'm going to talk about 6 strategies to manage resistance. Avoiding defense reactions, classifying the client's behavior, confronting client's contradiction, exposing the client's secondary gain, reframing the client's definition of control, confronting normative resistance. So number 1, avoiding defensive reaction. The 6 strategies for managing resistance are, which I just discussed. Counselors who react defensively to resistant clients are often unaware of their defensiveness and their attempt to reduce their own emotional pain. Counselors can overcome defensiveness toward resistant minorities clients by anticipating the resistance will come. Resistance comes in many shapes and forms, and counselors should consider resistance as the norm, than the exception to counseling. Counselors should identify any racial content associated with their feelings. One of the most accurate indicators of racial defensiveness is when a counselor tries to convince themselves that they are not prejudiced. Second, classifying the client's behavior. Counselors should classify clients' behavior as either resistance or non-resistance. Successful resistant management depends on the counselor's ability to assess the client's behavior thoroughly and match it to one of the 4 quadrants discussed in the previous slide. A common mistake counselors make is classifying protest as antagonism, which means just because the client is not resistant to counseling does not mean they are cooperative. So just because you don't visually see any outward signs of resistance doesn't mean that there's not resistance, is what that one basically means. Resistant clients and sending contradictory messages. That tends to confuse the client counselors, who must interpret what the clients are actually communicating. The counselors must determine if the client is really interested in changing. This section also discussed African American clients having anxiety when dealing with a white counselor and not trusting their vulnerability to them. The best way to handle a client who is making contradictory statements is to confront them and inquire about the client's resistance. Next, exposing the client's secondary gain. Some clients are skilled in manipulating counselors, and although such behavior is counter-therapeutic, these clients benefit from their action. To counter this resistance, counselors' best approach is to be alert to signs of manipulation and then directly expose the manipulation when they find it. Next, reframing the client's definition of control. Many clients are afraid of counseling. They may fear the pain of growth that goes with starting new behavior and stopping old behaviors, or they may be afraid of disclosing intimate details of their life to another person. To deal with such insecurities, they often try to control their counselor and the counseling situation. Counselors can disarm this type of resistance by giving clients a new definition of control. First, counselors should emphasize with the client's fear. In this way, counselors can help clients accept their feelings as legitimate. The last thing a counselor should do is overlook and minimize or invalidate the client's feelings. Competent counselors know that clients typically act out their unacknowledged fear in a form of self-defeating behavior. When a client is fearful, a counselor might use a general empathetic intervention. Next, confronting normative resistance. With a minority client, some resistance may reflect the norm of the client's minority culture rather than an individual attitude. The counselor should attempt to trace the resistance back to the client's cultural value. When resistance is a cultural base, anyone from the client's culture would likely show the same type of resistance. The book provides an example. Many Asian clients, for instance, avoid discussing family problems with counselors because of the cultural value of saving face. They do not want to bring shame on themselves or their family by admitting that they have psychological problems. Counselors who ignore such cultural norms probably create more problems than they solve. To confront normative resistance, counselors should begin by recognizing the anxiety-reducing function of the cultural norm. A counselor can learn what cultural values are important to the client by observing and listening to the client's reaction to proposal for change. Although counselors should avoid imposing their own cultural value on their client, they may need to challenge normative resistance when it is obviously counter-therapeutic. And that concludes my presentation on resistance in chapter 10. Thank you.